Thanks. Welcome everyone to our 19th MyHR Live. We're nearly in the 20s, which is quite shocking because it feels like we haven't been doing these for that long. The topic today is restructuring and redundancies, which is never a fun one, either as an employer or an employee to discuss. But we'll be going through kind of the basics of getting a restructure right so that you know if it comes time to make changes in your business, you're much better prepared to make those changes fairly for all involved. It's a really drizzly day here in Auckland. Spring has well and truly arrived. We'll go through some housekeeping to start off with, and then I'll just list off the topics we'll be covering, and then we'll get stuck straight into content. So housekeeping, please ask questions as we go through. You're very welcome to do so. We'll collate them and answer them at the end. The video recording will be available later on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and on our YouTube channel. So if you miss a piece or couldn't attend for the whole of the video, you will be able to access it afterwards. We did have some audio issues last time, so we'll make sure that we have a transcript available afterwards in case the audio cuts out again, so you'll be able to get the content. And just with those questions, a quick reminder, because the video recording is available, not to use any identifying details, and we'll kind of screen them out as we ask those questions. So great, restructuring and redundancies, we'll get into it. We'll be talking about what a restructure is. We'll run through the process for running a restructure and talk about those steps in more detail. I'll run through some of the common fish hooks that people get wrong or common missteps that people make. We'll talk briefly about the worst case if you do get it wrong, and then we'll have time for questions. So not a massive session today, and I'm hoping we'll be able to get through it in about 20 minutes. So a restructure at its core is a consultation process about changes to positions or changes to the business. It's about the positions or the jobs or the work that's being done in your company or your team. It's not about the people doing those roles, and we'll talk about that more in more detail because it's important to get right. You can run a restructure with one person if you just have one job that you don't need anymore. You can run a restructure with hundreds and thousands, as banks and kind of those larger organizations often do. The size of it doesn't matter. The process is pretty much the same in terms of what you need to do to be on the right side of the law. But again, it's consulting each individual about changes that you're proposing to make as a business, whether those are small to medium-sized changes or whether you're looking at completely getting rid of their role. So it's important to make sure that you have that consultation process right so you can go ahead with those changes without opening yourself up to too much legal risk. Just again, it's about the position or the work or the strategy change of the business. It's not a quick fire mechanism to get rid of someone you don't like. That will lead you into hot water really, really quickly. So remembering that you need to have a genuine commercial reason for engaging in a consultation process. So in terms of running through the process, there are 5 main steps, or 6 main steps really, to talk about. The first is prep. So when you're thinking about going through a restructure process, maybe you export to China and they've changed their import kind of standards, and so now half your business is gone, or you as a business are looking at shifting your company from design and build of houses away just to the design or just to the build. So you've made a strategic decision to change. Whether you have brought on a management role into the business, and so now you need less of the day-to-day because the manager is doing a really good job coordinating. All of those situations or changes are perfectly valid reasons to go ahead with the restructure, but part of your prep stage is preparing and presenting that argument to your team. So making sure you've got a good commercial reason for going ahead, making sure that you have all of the information available, particularly if you're relying on financial arguments for the change. For example, to say our revenue's down 5% year on year, we're really struggling and we're having to make cost cuts across the business to make sure that the business is viable. You'll need to be able to demonstrate that your revenue has been down 5% year on year and why you've picked these roles as part of your cost cutting exercise. So making sure that prep is there, that you've got the story, you've got the details, and you've got a plan in terms of how you're going to roll that out across your team. So once you've got your prep, the next step is your first meeting. You can meet with the affected members of your business as a team. You can meet with them as individuals. It doesn't really matter how you manage that first meeting, or it does, but not from a legal perspective, more from managing the human emotions and the human feelings involved in the process. So whether it's an individual meeting or a team meeting, what you're basically doing is saying to these people, hey, here is what's happening, here is our story, here are our details, here are the changes we're proposing, here's the process we're going to go through. It's really important that you give us your side of the story, but that will happen at a second meeting. So we're just communicating to you today, do you have any questions at all? It may come as a bit of a shock, especially if it's a strategic change that where the writing may not have been on the wall. If it's as a result of challenging kind of financial times, or if there's an economic downturn, it may not be much of a shock, but people are usually upset at the stage because if their job's on the line, obviously that throws a lot of uncertainty into their life. So be kind, leave lots of time, and make sure you've got everything you need to give them so that they can feel as prepared as possible to go through the rest of the process. So prep, meeting one. You then give the employee or employees, plural, some time to go through your proposal and make sure they understand it and prepare a response to what it is you've proposed. So the second meeting, which is part 3, is where the employee gives you their side of the story so that you have all the information you might need to make sure that what you've proposed makes sense, and to make sure that you haven't missed any other outcome. Realistically, in my experience, and we run kind of between 5 and 10 restructures a week, so we do quite a few of these, anywhere from 1 in 12 to 1 in 18 maybe will come up with new information. Most of the time as the business, you've done a really, really good job in the prep stage, so you've thought about what your different options are, you've thought about what your choices might be in terms of making these changes, and you're going ahead with the one that makes the most sense. So there isn't always something new that comes up, but it's really, really important to meet your kind of good faith obligation, so this is a legal requirement, that you give the employee a chance to comment on what's going on and a chance to comment on the proposed changes. So that's the second meeting. You then go away, you have a think about what they've said, if they have identified any flaws in your reasoning, or if they have identified something different you might do to address the issue instead of the changes that you've proposed. By law, you need to fairly consider that, and if you choose not to go ahead with their suggestions, that's fine, but you have to be able to explain and justify why. And if it's something like a strategic change, so at a high level you've made a choice to reorient the business, if their changes don't align with that new vision, that's a perfectly legitimate reason to say we're not going to accept those changes because it doesn't make sense given that we're refocusing on only building houses, not designing and building them. But if it's a financial piece and there's some numbers that you've missed, you do need to reconsider and make sure that you have good reasoning for going ahead. So that's the second meeting. So fourth piece is the third meeting where you confirm to the employee that you've made a decision. So you've gone ahead and you have consulted with them, they've given you their feedback. Whether you have or haven't taken on their suggestions, you communicate to them at this third meeting, which is the fourth step in the process, just to make it confusing. And you kind of confirm what's happening next. So if they're being redeployed into a role, this is where you'll tell them that's a consideration. If you're asking them to express your interest in other available roles, or if you're going from let's say 10 carpenters or 10 sales reps down to 6 carpenters or 6 sales reps, and you're asking them to express their interest in those remaining positions, this is where you'll do that. And you're kind of confirming that the business is changing and dealing with the fallout of how that might affect your people. So the fifth step then is going ahead and actually implementing those changes. So if you're making people redundant, they'll have a notice period that either you can pay them out or they can work out, or you can put them on gardening leave if you want to. If you're moving people into new roles, this gives you some time to sort that out. If you're asking people to apply for these other roles that might be available, this gives them time for that to happen. And if you are interviewing them, you may not need to because you know them well enough in your business. This is where all that kind of wrap-up work takes place. So as the fifth step, the sixth and final step is what we talk about as survivor management, which sounds much more kind of military and Navy than it does HR. But once you've made changes to your business, whether that's rearranging responsibilities, whether that's cutting people from your team, cutting roles from your team, the people who are left behind are going to feel a bit more on edge and are going to be a bit uncomfortable for a while because they've gone through a stressful, potentially upsetting change process where some of their colleagues may not be in the business any longer. So making sure that you have some time in your calendar and in your headspace as a business owner or manager to make sure that you are taking care of your survivors and kind of doing some work to rebuild the feeling in the team. It's a step that often gets missed, but is really, really important. So do make sure that you've got time to manage your survivors once all's said and done and wrap up that process. Cool. So that's a really quick overview of a restructure process. That's how it works if it all goes well. Often it doesn't. Things that can go sideways include people asking for more time to consider your proposal, people asking for more details. If you've got someone who's going to dig their heels in, that's where that will happen. So it doesn't always run as smoothly as kind of I've made it sound. There are plenty of ways it can go sideways. So if you do ever have any questions, of course, me and my team are here to help. And with clients of MyHR, we do a lot of work making sure that it goes as smoothly as possible, or if not, we've got kind of plan B, C, and D to capture any changes. So yeah, be aware that it's not always that straightforward is the takeaway. So moving on to fish hooks, what can go wrong in terms of detail? What can you get wrong as the person managing the process, and what do you need to be mindful of? Because there's always hidden pitfalls in HR and employment law, as you'll probably understand. So fish hook number one is not taking everyone through the process. And by that I mean, if you were saying to me, Sylvie, I've got 10 sales reps, sales have dropped 40% over the last 12 months, I need to make some really drastic changes to make sure the business can survive, and I'm looking at cutting my sales reps from 10 till 6, I'll say, sure, that makes sense. Let me check your financials. That all sounds pretty kosher. And if you then say to me, well, I know who my 4 worst sales reps are, so I'm not going to consult with my best 6. I'm just going to consult with my worst 4 to get rid of them. That's a major misstep if you do that. What you need to do by law is consult with everyone in that position you're thinking of changing, and then make the language is a fair and reasonable decision about who you're going to keep in the business. And a really common, quite quick way of assessing that is through a skills matrix. So I won't go into that into detail because there's a lot to talk about, but if you are looking at reducing a team of 10 to 6, or a team of 100 to 80, or a team of 3 to 2, and those roles are all identical roles or substantially similar roles, you need to consult with everyone to take them through the process. You can't, off the top of your head, pick your worst 20 or your worst 4 or your worst 1 and take them through. It needs to be everyone. The second fish hook is not genuinely considering feedback. So if you have made a financial misstep in your prep stage, which is that stage 1 that we talked about, and as you're presenting your data and your proposal to the team, they pick up on it, you need to adjust your plans to account for that financial misstep. Or if you're saying to the team, here is what we're seeing in terms of pressure on the business, we're making these changes to accommodate that pressure, whether that's market forces, a competitor, again, kind of an economic downturn, and they identify things that you've missed, you have to account for that. Or if they give you feedback which could make sense in the context of your changes. We had a client who is a retail business, and one of their retail stores was struggling. When they went through the consultation process with their team to close the store, one of their team suggested a different revenue stream in the form of piercing and tattoos, so opening a piercing studio, which totally fit with their brand and was a great idea. They implemented that, and then they didn't have to close the store because the extra revenue kept them going until they could get their retail numbers up again. So I said kind of 1 in 12, 1 in sort of 14 or 18. Those suggestions you do need to consider, so make sure that you do take that into account. The third fish hook, and one that I see reasonably often, is when you don't give your employees all the information that you're considering, which they need access to make their own, to inform their own decisions and to inform their response to you as the employer. So if you have financial data, if you're referencing profit and loss statements, you need to give them that data. Holding it back because it's private and confidential isn't really good enough. Withholding information like other employees' salaries can sometimes be okay, depending on the context. But if you are saying our numbers are down by this much, you have to be prepared to kind of walk the talk and give them the numbers for them to see. So strategy changes, again, any content around like a full strategy document, you need to provide that to them, because if you don't give it to them and they then ask for it, by law they have a right to see that data. So it's much better to front foot it, do all the homework up front and give them everything rather than kind of hold back and see where things sort of land. That includes giving the team the skills matrix you will use, or whatever other criteria you would use to assess who would stay and who would go at the front of the process. So it's best to give it to them at the front. If you give it to them partway through, they need to have enough time from that date to consider the skills matrix or whatever else you're using, but make sure that they have a copy of that as well, so that they know against what criteria they'll be assessed if they stay or go. And fourth and finally, we don't see this a lot with our clients because we work quite hard to avoid this situation, but not having a good commercial justification for your process is absolutely fatal. So if you are trying to get rid of one person who's a dickhead or who you don't like or who's underperforming, a restructure is legally not the way to manage it, and the courts and lawyers and advocates are really, really aggressive and really persistent in looking to make sure that your commercial justification is there and is valid. So make sure that your finances do show that your revenue's dropped 5% over the last 4 years, or that your profit is down, or whatever it is that you're arguing. You need to be pretty rock solid that this makes sense. Where this can come in, where that line is blurred, normally it's pretty easy to tell if it's if your issue is your person, not your work or your jobs or the distribution of work, and we can have that conversation. Where the line gets blurred a bit, to be honest, is with salespeople, because if a salesperson is underperforming, then your revenue will be down because you're not getting new business or you're not getting that repeat business. So that can be a bit of a delicate one to balance. It's not impossible to get over the line. You just need to be quite clear on aligning your argument with the way the role is structured or with the revenue that's coming in, rather than going, you suck, I'm going to boot you and then get someone new in to do exactly your same job, because that can be problematic too. So those are kind of the 4 big fish hooks that we come across, or 4 big pitfalls that we want you to avoid. In terms of a worst case, the reason you're going through this whole process is because employees can raise personal grievances for unjustified disadvantage, unjustified dismissal, and potentially breach of good faith and breach of contract, depending on what went down. So personal grievance awards in the Employment Relations Authority are increasing in the order of thousands. They're not minor increases. I think the figure was that they've increased overall 25% on average over the last 3 or 4 years. I'll check that, but it's something in that order of magnitude. So there are some pretty serious financial penalties kind of in play if you get it wrong. Remembering too that a successful grievance will include awards for hurt and humiliation. It will include lost wages. So if your employee hasn't been able to find a job for 6 months, you might be on the line for 6 months of lost wages for them. It will include costs as well if you lose the personal grievance. And if you've done something that the ERA is particularly unhappy about, you might have to pay a penalty to them as well, but that's a bit more unusual. So hurt humiliation payments, lost wages, and then costs as well for the employee. Being aware too that this is not a fun process for anyone. When it's your business or your team or your baby that you've worked on and loved and sweated and cried and bled over, when you're having to make these kinds of changes, it's really stressful for both sides. So you want to make sure that you're running a smooth process that wraps up as soon as it can, so you can get on with your day job, which is keeping a business or a team going, and your team can move on with their lives in terms of contributing to the business. So worst case, it drags on for a long time, and if you have one employee or 2 or 4 who are being sticks in the mud and not playing ball and not carrying on with the process, that can again drag it out for you, for their colleagues. So you want to make sure you've got a pretty tight plan to manage things so that it's over and done with as fast as possible. That's kind of all the content I had to cover today. So restructuring, be careful, do lots of prep, make sure your process is tight, and make sure that you're fairly consulting with everyone so that everyone gets a fair go if their job is on the line. Other takeaways. We now have time for questions, so I'll check in to see if there's anything. No, great, you're all pros now. Thank you so much for your time and attention. It's always a pleasure to do these. Restructuring and redundancies can be, it's a really process heavy topic, and it can be easy to get wrong and a bit hard to get right. If you do ever have any questions, you're very welcome to get in touch with us. You can message us on Facebook, on LinkedIn. You can call us on 0800 69 4769, and you can email us on info@myhr.co.nz as well. But until next time, thanks for your attention. Have a lovely rest of your day.